In the early 19th century, Napoleon Bonaparte was at the height of his power. He had conquered Europe, defeated powerful monarchies, and crowned himself the Emperor of France. However, in June 1812, Napoleon made an enormous mistake that led to his demise. He attempted to take on the grandest challenge of all, to invade the largest country in the world, and he did it by sending the largest army the world had ever seen. 600,000 men would march into Russia. However, after the war was over, only 40,000 returned. It was the most catastrophic defeat that Napoleon had ever suffered. The casualties of war were tremendous on both sides, but the shocking thing is that most of Napoleon's men didn't die in battle. They died of hunger, disease, and despair. Napoleon's Russian invasion is the most tragic war campaign ever recorded in French military history. So what went wrong? What are the mistakes that led to all this? Stay tuned and let's find out together. In 1807, France and Russia signed a treaty of alliance, bringing peace between the two powerful nations. This treaty was extremely favorable to France, as it increased its influence in Europe and allowed it to annex nearly half of Poland. Russia joined Napoleon's continental system, a blockade intended to paralyze Britain's economy by closing European ports to British goods. However, this treaty was unpopular in the Russian court because it strained the Russian economy and gave France significant influence over Poland, a region Russia considered vital to its own security. In the following years, Tsar Alexander I took actions that repudiated the contract he signed with Napoleon. Russia returned to trading with Britain. Military tensions boiled over along the borders, and mutual distrust tore their alliance apart. By August 1811, Napoleon had had enough. He decided to invade Russia and make himself the ruler of the largest empire in the world. It was an ambitious move, to be sure. Many of his advisors warned him of the dangers inherent in invading such a vast country, and yet the emperor felt extremely confident. In June 1812, Napoleon led the largest army the world had ever seen. 600,000 men would march into Russia, 422,000 in his main attack force, and the rest to secure supply lines. And yet the invasion began to unravel almost immediately as soon as they had crossed the Niemen River at Convo. As they marched deeper into the country, French supplies located along the borders failed to reach the forward troops fast enough, and the army had to live off the land. However, the Russian peasants along the march refused to sell their food at any price and burned their hay instead of letting the French have it. As a result, thousands of men died of disease and hunger. Town after town was left empty and abandoned. Crops were destroyed to deny the French supplies. The Russians even burned their cities to the ground without a fight to defend them. Despite Napoleon's preparations, his army had a hard time going forward due to the terrible road and weather conditions. During the march, scattered Cossack raiders were harassing the French army, ambushing and slaughtering men day after day. By the time Napoleon reached Smolensk, only 175,000 men remained. The Russians withdrew once more, abandoning a scorched and devastated city with no supplies to sustain his army or spoils to seize. Still, the Russians did not surrender, and Napoleon had to decide whether to wait through the winter at Smolensk or march on Moscow. He chose the latter, suspecting that the Tsar would muster more forces to defeat his dwindling troops. On the way to Moscow, the Russians turned to face the French in battle at last, near the village of Borodino. They fought bitterly, harder than any army Napoleon had ever faced. That day, Napoleon lost 30,000 men, a catastrophic loss with no decisive gain. Even so, after hours of brutal fighting, the Russians retreated once again, and Napoleon's forces had suffered horrific casualties. The Russian army was still intact. On September 14th, Napoleon entered Moscow as a conquering hero, but to his dismay, he found it empty and silent as the grave. The Russians had left, all the supplies had gone, and every water pump had been removed to make the city even more uninhabitable. After that, a terrible fire broke out which reduced the city to ash. Napoleon was shocked. He could not understand the Russians' mindset. To him, this was madness. They would rather burn their own city to the ground than to negotiate peace with him. Napoleon had never faced an enemy so fierce, so ruthless, so relentless. Napoleon sent letters to the Tsar offering him generous terms of peace. The Russians seemed willing to negotiate at first, so Napoleon waited over a month in Moscow for a resolution to happen. This was his fatal mistake. In fact, the Russians never intended to make peace, and only meant to drag out the talks to buy themselves time to build up their army and let winter grow closer. But by the time Napoleon realized this, it was too late. Winter set in. On October 19th, Napoleon made another enormous mistake by leading his shattered army out of the ruins of Moscow to go back to Smolensk. At that time, the road west was filled with untold dangers. Hundreds of Cossack raiders formed guerrilla forces and attacked and killed many French soldiers as they limped on in retreat. Haunted by the dread, French soldiers marched without rest. Sleep was rare, food was scarce. Exhaustion and starvation claimed thousands of lives. Horses died from the cold, and the surviving soldiers stumbled their way back to Smolensk on foot. The French army kept retreating, while the Russians kept hounding them, depleting their forces and exposing them to the harsh wintry terrain. By the end of the campaign, on December 6th, only 10,000 men of his main attack force made it out of Russia alive. The French army suffered terrible losses, and Napoleon would never be able to recoup neither the manpower nor the horses he lost after this campaign. Russia was indeed his graveyard. Napoleon's invasion of Russia is one of history's most studied cases. Based on rigorous study and analysis, we will now learn the key mistakes made in the campaign. Napoleon was appointed commander of the French army at the age of 26. He became first consul at the age of 30 and crowned himself Emperor of France at the age of 35. He had won many victories in his early career before he decided to invade Russia. He had defeated the mighty armies of Austria, Russia, and Prussia. He had stabilized the French economy and turned it into a commercial success. He had even enacted his own laws in the Napoleonic Code. During his early reign, France was powerful, proud, and stood head and shoulders above any other country in Europe. Yet in spite of all this, his many successes inflated his ego and blinded his judgment. Napoleon was a highly intelligent and well-read man. He had studied the disastrous campaign of King Charles XII of Sweden, which mirrored exactly what happened to him in Russia. He knew about the logistical nightmare of invading such a large country. He knew his supplies would never be able to reach so far into Russian territory. He knew about the scorched earth tactics the Russians applied, and he knew about the harshness of the Russian winter. Yet for all that, he went into Russia anyway. Napoleon could have applied pressure on Russia via diplomacy, localized military threats, or applied economic coercion, but he felt supremely confident in conquering this huge empire. He literally told his ministers that he foresaw complete victory within 3 weeks. In the past, these predictions had been incredibly accurate. However, he was utterly mistaken. He had underestimated the Russian strong will to resist and overestimated his army's ability to sustain itself so far from home. Napoleon's arrogance, hubris, and overconfidence sowed the seeds of his own eventual destruction. Therefore, we should remember that regardless of what we have achieved in the past, we mustn't let pride overcome us and blind us from seeing the big picture as it did with Napoleon. The logistics alone of traversing the Russian terrain was a nightmare in itself, and Napoleon knew it. As a result, he had placed vast storehouses close to the borders of Russia, filled with wheat and rice to support his army. However, it was impossible for these supplies to reach the army as it marched deeper into Russian territory. Napoleon thought his army could be self-sufficient, but he failed to account for the Russian scorched earth tactics as they burnt all crops and supplies while retreating. Within days of the invasion, more than 10,000 horses ate rank grass and died, while hundreds of men died of hunger and disease. On top of that, his army lacked winter gear, which exposed the French to the harshness of the Russian winter. Thousands of French soldiers died from the cold, and every last soldier had to trudge his way back in retreat by the end of the campaign. A slower, more prepared advance, with depots and supply lines secured through Poland and Lithuania, could have allowed for sustainable operations, thus increasing Napoleon's chances for victory, or at least guaranteeing him a less catastrophic withdrawal. This clearly teaches us the importance of logistics and being prepared for life's unexpected challenges. Napoleon's decision to invade Russia was in many ways an act of impatience. After the Tsar repudiated their alliance in 1811, Napoleon was frustrated and angry. He wanted to teach his Russian rival a lesson, and he wanted to do it immediately. So he rushed into an enormous campaign through a vast and treacherous land without proper consideration for the magnitude of such an invasion. Furthermore, the Russians saw Napoleon as an aggressive man who liked any kind of fight, even if the odds are stacked against him. Indeed, he was eager to fight rather than settle his disputes with Russia in a slower, albeit diplomatic way. He was impatient to put his genius into play and prove himself a worthy opponent. However, the Russians refused to play his game. Instead, they made an insidious move. They took from him the one thing he desired most: the fight. They denied him a decisive battle to win the war and kept retreating. Instead of battle, the French got endless raids and pinprick attacks that came out of nowhere, a continuous threat that gradually weakened the French forces. While thousands of soldiers felt a disease, many more simply lost the will to fight. In the end, Napoleon's inability to engage his enemy got under his skin. His emotions of frustration, anger, and confusion overcame him and overwhelmed his ability to strategize, and that caused him to make fatal mistakes that led to his ultimate defeat. At the end of this video, I invite you to share your perspective. What mistakes do you think Napoleon made, and what lessons can we learn from them? Drop your answer in the comments and let's learn from each other. And if you have found this video insightful, hit the like button and subscribe to the channel. Thank you for watching and see you in the next video.